The weight of assumption. An act of kindness unravels. The train station buzzed with the usual symphony of activity. Doors hissing open, footsteps echoing, and the faint hum of conversations blending into the background. Elijah, a young black man in his late 20s, adjusted his backpack as he stepped onto the subway platform. He was tired. His shift at the auto repair shop had been grueling, but the thought of getting home to his little sister's birthday dinner kept him moving. As the train screeched to a halt, Elijah joined the throng, squeezing into the already crowded car. He managed to find a spot by the door, one hand gripping the overhead bar for balance. Across from him, he noticed a woman, visibly pregnant, holding onto a pole with one hand while clutching her oversized bag with the other. Her face glistened with sweat, and her legs trembled as the train jerked forward. Without thinking, Elijah stood up and gestured to his seat. "Here, ma'am, you look like you could use this," he said, his tone kind but firm. The woman hesitated, looking a little embarrassed, but eventually gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you so much," she murmured as she sank into the seat. Elijah nodded and shifted to stand closer to the door. He glanced at his watch, still enough time to make it to dinner if the train stayed on schedule. For a moment, he felt good about his small act of kindness, but the moment didn't last. As the train pulled into the next station, the woman's head suddenly slumped forward. Her bag slid to the floor, and she collapsed onto her knees, gasping for air. The entire car froze. A man near her shouted, "Someone help her." Elijah instinctively moved toward her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, crouching down. Another passenger yelled for someone to pull the emergency brake, while others scrambled to call 911. The air was thick with panic, voices overlapping in confusion. Elijah stayed by the woman's side, unsure of what else to do. Then, as she was helped into a sitting position by another passenger, she pointed directly at Elijah. Her voice was weak but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. "It was him," she gasped. He did something to me." The murmur started low but insidious. People around Elijah began to exchange wary glances, and the air seemed to shift. But this was only the beginning. For a moment, Elijah thought he misheard her. His mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. The woman repeated, louder this time. "He did something to me." She clutched her stomach, wincing, and the passengers around her shifted uneasily. "Whoa, hold on," Elijah said, raising his hands defensively. "I didn't do anything. I just gave her my seat." The murmurs grew louder now, a wave of suspicion rippling through the car. A man in a grey suit near the woman spoke up, his brow furrowed. "I saw him standing close to her. What were you doing near her bag?" Elijah turned toward the man, incredulous. "I wasn't near her bag. I was standing by the door the whole time." But it didn't seem to matter. People were already piecing together their own version of events, their assumptions filling in the gaps. A woman with a stroller muttered something under her breath, casting a wary glance at Elijah. Another passenger, an older man with glasses, stepped between Elijah and the pregnant woman as if to shield her. "Someone call the police!" a voice shouted from the back. Elijah's stomach sank. "Why would you call the cops? I didn't do anything." His voice cracked slightly, not from fear but from frustration. The train screeched to a stop at the next station, and moments later, 2 transit officers boarded the car. Their presence seemed to intensify the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, surveying the scene. Passengers immediately began talking over one another, pointing fingers and giving fragmented accounts of what they thought had happened. "She collapsed, and he was right there," one woman said, nodding toward Elijah. "He gave up his seat, but then, I don't know, something feels off," another added hesitantly. The officers looked at Elijah, who stood frozen in place, his hands still raised slightly, as if to prove he meant no harm. "You," one officer said, gesturing toward him, "step off the train so we can sort this out." "I didn't do anything," Elijah protested, his voice firmer now. "I just gave her my seat. Ask anyone." The officers exchanged a glance before one replied, "We'll figure that out. Let's go." But before Elijah could move, another voice cut through the tension. "Wait!" It was a teenage girl with braids sitting near the back of the car. She stood up, her phone in hand. "I saw the whole thing. He didn't touch her or her stuff. He literally just gave her his seat." Her words hung in the air, a small crack in the wall of suspicion, but it wasn't enough to dissolve the doubt entirely. Elijah's heart pounded. He wanted to scream, to demand why she was doing this, but he knew better. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Stay calm no matter what. Don't give them any reason to see you as a threat. The officers, now visibly more alert, asked him to step aside again. Sir, this is just protocol. We need to get her medical attention and figure out what's going on. Reluctantly, Elijah nodded and followed them off the train, feeling every pair of eyes on him as he walked. The whispers behind him stung more than he cared to admit. Outside the car, the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew heavier as more officers arrived and passengers spilled onto the platform, their accounts becoming more dramatic with each retelling. But things were about to take an even darker turn. Elijah stood on the platform, his back against the cold concrete wall, as two officers questioned him. Around them, a small crowd gathered, whispering and pointing. The pregnant woman sat on a bench a few feet away, clutching her belly and shaking her head as paramedics examined her. Every now and then her gaze flicked toward Elijah, a mix of fear and accusation in her eyes. Let me get this straight, the taller officer said, flipping open his notepad. You're saying you gave up your seat and that's all that happened? Yes, Elijah replied firmly. That's all I did. I don't even know this woman. The shorter officer chimed in. Then why would she accuse you of something? People don't just make these things up. Elijah clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. I don't know why she's saying this. Maybe she's confused, or maybe something else is going on, but I didn't do anything wrong. From behind the officers, a middle-aged woman in a red coat stepped forward. I saw him too, she said, her voice hesitant. He was acting kind of close to her, you know what I mean. Elijah's eyes widened. What? I wasn't anywhere near her except to offer my seat. The taller officer nodded toward the woman. Ma'am, did you see anything else suspicious? She shook her head slowly. No, but I think it's worth looking into. You can't be too careful these days. The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He turned to the officers, his voice rising. This is ridiculous. You're taking her word and a bunch of guesses over facts. Check the security cameras if you don't believe me. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them sighed. We're working on it. Just cooperate, okay? Meanwhile, the crowd grew restless. People whispered louder now, speculating wildly. He probably slipped something into her drink, a man muttered. Or tried to take her bag, someone else suggested. Look at him, he's so defensive. That's a red flag, a woman added. Elijah heard every word, and his blood boiled. But before he could say anything, the teenage girl who had spoken up earlier stepped forward again, holding her phone. Excuse me, she said loudly, her voice cutting through the chatter. I have a video. I was recording a TikTok when this all happened. He didn't do anything, look. She handed her phone to the shorter officer, who watched the video carefully. The screen showed Elijah standing by the door, hands on the rail, minding his own business. The moment he gave up his seat was clear, as was his distance from the pregnant woman afterward. The officer's expression softened slightly as he handed the phone to his partner. This doesn't show any contact between him and the woman, he admitted. The taller officer frowned, then turned to the pregnant woman. Ma'am, are you absolutely sure it was him? Her face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't know, she stammered. I felt dizzy, and he was right there. I just assumed. Elijah felt a mix of relief and frustration. You assumed? You've got half this platform thinking I'm some kind of criminal because you assumed. The crowd's whispers shifted now, uncertainty rippling through them. Some people looked embarrassed, others doubled down on their suspicions. But just as things seemed to calm, one of the paramedics spoke up. Her blood pressure is dangerously low. This could explain the dizziness and confusion, but we need to get her to the hospital to run some tests. The officers nodded, then turned back to Elijah. We're not detaining you, the taller one said, though his tone was far from apologetic. But we'll need to file a report. Stay nearby in case we need more information. Elijah's jaw tightened. Fine. Do what you have to do. As the paramedics wheeled the woman away and the crowd slowly dispersed, Elijah remained on the platform, shaken but not broken. However, the damage had already been done, and the fight for his dignity wasn't over yet. Elijah stayed on the platform, leaning against a steel pillar. As the crowd thinned out, a few stragglers lingered, still casting furtive glances his way. But most people seemed eager to leave the uncomfortable scene behind. His mind raced, Every fiber of his being screamed at the injustice of it all. How quickly assumptions had painted him as the villain. He noticed the teenage girl who had defended him earlier, standing nearby, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and caught his eye, offering a small apologetic smile. "Thanks for speaking up," Elijah said. His voice strained but sincere. She shrugged. "It's just messed up how everyone jumped on you like that. People always assume the worst for no reason." Her words lingered in the air. No reason. Elijah knew better. He'd seen it before, felt it before. It wasn't no reason. As he stood there, one of the officers approached him again. "Listen," the taller one began, his tone more measured now. "We reviewed the security footage from the train. It backs up what you said. You didn't do anything wrong, you're free to go." Elijah let out a sharp exhale, relief flooding through him. "I told you that from the start," he said, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, well, we had to be thorough. You know how it is." Elijah stared at him, the words catching in his throat. Did he really know how it was? Or was the officer just excusing the implicit bias that had colored the entire situation? Before he could respond, the paramedics returned from the ambulance parked outside. One of them walked over to Elijah and the officer. "She's stabilized now," the paramedic said. "Turns out her dizziness was caused by a severe drop in blood pressure. Nothing to do with anyone on the train. It could have happened anywhere." The officer nodded, as if that settled the matter. "All right. Thanks for the update." He turned back to Elijah. "Looks like this was all a big misunderstanding." Elijah felt his jaw clench again. Misunderstanding? The word felt too light, too casual for the weight of what had just happened. "Misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone icy. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have a whole train of people look at you like you're a criminal? To hear them whisper, point, assume?" The officer looked down awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "Look, I get it, okay? But it's over now. You can go." Elijah laughed bitterly. "It's over for you. For me, this will stick in my mind every time I get on a train, every time someone looks at me sideways. You don't get to tell me it's over." The officer didn't respond, and after a moment he walked away. The teenage girl approached Elijah again, holding up her phone. "I posted the video," she said softly. "The whole thing, from you giving up your seat to everyone blaming you. People need to see what really happened. Stop jumping to conclusions. Maybe this will make someone think twice next time." Elijah nodded, appreciating the gesture, even if he wasn't sure it would change anything. As he finally made his way out of the station, his phone buzzed. It was his sister, asking if he was still coming to her birthday dinner. Elijah hesitated before responding. The weight of the evening pressed on him, but he knew he couldn't let it ruin the one bright spot in his day. "I'm on my way," he texted back. But as he walked through the city streets, Elijah couldn't shake the nagging thought. How many others had faced the same rush to judgment without someone like that teenager to stand up for them? And how often did those stories end differently? Later that evening, Elijah sat at his sister's dining table, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filling the room. He smiled faintly as his little sister blew out her candles, the warmth of family easing some of the tension still knotted in his chest. But even as he celebrated, his mind kept circling back to the events of the day, the way assumptions could snowball, how quickly kindness could be twisted into suspicion, and the fragility of trust among strangers. After the cake was cut and the dishes cleared, Elijah stepped out onto the small balcony for a moment of quiet. His sister joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You okay?" she asked, sensing something was off. Elijah hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just had a rough ride home." She didn't press, but he could tell she wanted to. Finally, he sighed and told her the story every detail, from the act of giving up his seat to the accusations and the girl who came to his defense. When he finished, she shook her head, her expression a mix of sadness and anger. "It's not fair," she said softly. "You did the right thing, and somehow you still ended up being the bad guy." Elijah nodded, staring out at the city lights. "It's not just me, though. This happens to people all the time. I was lucky that girl had my back. Not everyone gets that." His sister rested a hand on his shoulder. "You can't control what people assume, Eli, but you can control how you handle it. You stayed calm and you stood your ground. That says a lot about who you are." Elijah thought about her words. He hadn't felt calm in the moment. But looking back, he realized she was right. He could have lashed out, shouted, or stormed off, but he hadn't. And maybe that had made all the difference. As he stood there, a thought struck him. Kindness wasn't always easy, and it didn't always pay off the way you expected, but it mattered. Because the world was too quick to judge, too quick to assume, and someone had to break that cycle. He took a deep breath and turned back to his sister. "You know what? I'd do it again," he said quietly, even knowing how it turned out. She smiled. "That's why I'm proud of you." Stories like Elijah's remind us to pause, reflect, and challenge our own assumptions. Acts of kindness can ripple out in ways we don't always see, even when they're met with resistance. So the next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment, stop and ask, what's the full story? And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more content that challenges perspectives and inspires change.